Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and welcome back to another episode of my podcast, Inquisitor Vaughn's Voxcast. And in today's video, I want to talk about Space Marines. You guessed it by the title, right? In this video, I want to talk about just how Warhammer 40k would be without Space Marines. And I know a lot of you would say, oh, well, it's boring. It would be boring without Space Marines. And you're probably right, But I want to look a little bit deeper because there was a very strong possibility that Space Marines might not have existed in Warhammer 40k if the Horus Heresy didn't happen, right? I just wanted to say that Space Marines are my favorite faction. I've been playing Space Marines since I started playing Warhammer 40k. I love Space Marines. I love their lore, the different heraldries. I love the different armor types. I love the different chapter traditions, what it goes into creating Space Marines. I just find them super, super cool. And they're basically the poster boy of Warhammer 40k. It's hard to see any kind of advertisement for Warhammer 40k without Space Marines. I personally don't like Primaris Marines, but because they are Space Marines, I like them. I'm biased toward Space Marines to the point that even though I don't like Primaris Marines, because they are still Primaris Marines, I like them. I accept them. I acknowledge them. I'm happy that people are playing Space Marines in this new way. And I've actually eased up on expressing how much I don't like Primaris Marines because I've kind of rationalized it. And I've come to the conclusion that Primaris Marines make sense as the Space Marines of the 40th millennium. Because if you think about it, right, we've been calling Warhammer 40k Warhammer 40k since we started it, but in reality a lot of the conflicts that we represent on the tabletop, or at least we represented on the tabletop, the miniatures that we used, they all represent things that happened before the 40th millennium, right? Like a lot of the conflicts happened in between the Horus Heresy and the 40th millennium. There's like 10,000 years of history of Space Marines and battles that were fought and situations that happened that we used to reflect on the tabletop with the miniatures that we had, and we called it Warhammer 40k, but in reality it was just an extension of Warhammer 30k, because like I said, the 10,000 year gap between the 30th millennium, which would be the Horus Heresy when the Great Crusade happened, and the 40th millennium, which is the current timeline, right? Like I said, we've been calling Warhammer 40k since the beginning, even though a lot of the tabletop battles and conflicts and lore doesn't reflect a lot of the history that began in the 40th millennium. It actually began before that. It's for this reason that I think that, the old marks of armor, the Mark 2 through 7, right? 7, 8, because I think it ended with Errant before they created the Mark 10. Yeah, the marks of armor, the previous types of Space Marines, they're all characteristic of the 30th millennium, right? They're products of the 30th millennium. All of the armors besides some Maximus armor or the Primaris armor existed and were created in the Great Crusade, right? Either at its beginning or closer to its end. But all of the firstborn marks of armor, they were created during that time and they were utilized most during that time. So in that way, I think about what Primaris Marines represent as far as like a new kind of Space Marine, right? With additional organs and new kinds of armor. I think it makes sense that the Primaris Marines are the Space Marines of the 40th millennium. Like the firstborn were the Space Marine of the 30th millennium. All right, that's how I rationalize it in my head. And when I rationalize it that way, it's like I'm more willing to accept the fact that Primaris exist and that they're the face of, the Space Marine faction in Warhammer 40k right now. Of course, I'm not going to ignore the fact that they're really just a cash grab, an attempt at Games Workshop to own a specific kind of Space Marine brand, and so they call it Primaris because Space Marine, they can't really copyright that because that's such a widespread name, but Primaris they can, right? So I understand the implications behind why Games Workshop actually did it, but as far as me as someone who is a fan of the setting and a fan of the lore and a fan of the faction, I've rationalized why Space Marines or why Primaris Marines make sense in the setting as the Space Marines of the 40th millennium. And it has helped me to accept the changes that have happened to the Space Marine range. I still don't play Space Marines as far as like I don't play Primaris Marines, but I'm still a fan of the faction. I'm happy that people are playing Space Marines in this way. Even though I don't participate in it, I can always do Badab War, or I could always do Horus Heresy. And so there's no need for me to like continue spewing hate when I feel like it makes sense now, right? I feel like it makes Primaris Marines make sense, and they are the new Space Marines, right? So I love Space Marines as a faction. I've created multiple chapters of my own, multiple homebrews. I've played multiple canon chapters as well. Like I'm a hardcore fan of Space Marines. But sometimes when I look at the Warhammer 40k setting and I see how popular Space Marines are, and I see how popular the faction is and how it's become like the face of Warhammer 40k, it makes me think that Space Marines are a little bit too visible, and they are too much of a focus in Warhammer 40k. Like I feel like even in the lore, Space Marines are supposed to be like super rarely seen. Like a regular Imperial citizen will probably not see Space Marines because they're just not going to be in the same situation as a Space Marine would, right? Even Imperial Guardsmen who see Space Marines rarely see Space Marines. It's not like a common occurrence. And we play it on the tabletop as if it is, but according to the lore, it's like sometimes a Space Marine chapter will fight alongside an Astra Militarum regiment, sometimes not, and sometimes they'll fight like completely separate of them. But Space Marines, at least as far as the lore is concerned, are not supposed to be so commonly seen. They are basically the shock troops, right? They're the guys that come in when the fighting is at its thickest and they save the day. And then to maintain the mythology that they have around them as, you know, demigods and angels of death, they kind of disappear after a battle, right? They're supposed to be disattached from humanity because they're not necessarily humanity themselves. So when I look at that and I see Space Marines as like the main source of advertisement for Warhammer 40k, even though I love the faction, something about it just doesn't make sense to me. Like Space Marines should not be the main advertisement of Warhammer 40k. They should be rare. You know, they should be something that's heavily mythologized or turned into myth. They should be something that is rarely seen on the battlefield and like few people play them, and so on and so forth. I think the face of humanity in Warhammer 40k should actually be the Astra Militarum. I interpret Warhammer 40k from a rather grimdark perspective. I like the dark, gritty, hopeless interpretation of the Warhammer 40k setting, right? When Space Marines represent, or Space Marines are the face of humanity and the face of humanity's fighting force, it kind of takes away that grim darkness a little bit, because Space Marines are built for the grim darkness, right? They're built to withstand the horrors and to fight the horrors of the galaxy. So it's kind of actually even, you know? It takes away a little bit of that horror edge. But if the face of humanity's fighting force was the Astra Militarum, that would be grimdark, because humanity doesn't have a chance against the majority of the alien species that are in Warhammer 40k. They don't have a chance. Every single alien species that exists in the Warhammer 40k universe can easily kill humans, yet they still fight. I think that is grimdark. It's not even at all. It's stacked against humanity, and it's hopeless. You know, like it's pointless. The casualties that the Astra Militarum face in one battle is just ridiculous. Like most guardsmen are expected to only live a few hours after deployment if they're lucky. Like that is grimdark. Space Marines who are built to fight, you know, the horrors of the galaxy, it's cool, it's great, it's equal, but it's not as grim dark as humanity fighting against these aliens and forces of chaos, because it's like that is true hopelessness. That is true grim darkness. It's not even at all. There's no hope, but they still fight. And I like that idea. But the thought train of me thinking about Warhammer 40k from the perspective of there being no Space Marines, it's actually started when I started thinking about the Wars of Unification and the lore surrounding the Emperor's original plans for humanity and for his transhuman superhuman warriors. So the Emperor of Mankind, right, was a perpetual. He couldn't naturally die. But not only was he a perpetual, he was also a psychic or psyker, right? So he had psychic power and he was a perpetual. And this made him extremely powerful. And during the dark age of technology, he gathered a lot of other perpetuals. Some of them were psychers, some of them weren't, but he gathered all of these perpetuals and had a plan for humanity moving forward. And one of these perpetuals was Erda. Erda is considered the mother of the Primarchs. The reason why is because the Emperor used her DNA in order to create the Primarchs as well. She was a perpetual, and she joined the Emperor on this kind of quest toward his goal for humanity. She is the one that coined the term Homo sapiens superior, right? Because that's what she thought perpetuals were. They were superior, basically superior forms of humanity, or the next level in humanity's evolution, right? And the Emperor seemed to believe this as well. And so the original goal for the Emperor and what he had in mind for humanity was to make it so that all humans were perpetuals. He wanted to turn all humans, or he wanted to push the evolution of humanity to the point where they all became Homo sapiens superior. Of course, this is based really on the older lore, and a lot of the older lore has been retconned, but some of it hasn't really been retconned. It's just been pushed to the side. So the source of this lore about the Emperor's original goals for humanity is in the older editions of Warhammer 40k. The same editions that said that the Emperor was basically the collection of all the shamans' souls from Terra into one being. You know, that source of lore, it's from the same source, like way back in the day. It hasn't been retconned, but it also hasn't been brought up in recent times. But basically, the Emperor had a plan for humanity, and the plan would all go to shit when the dark age of technology would end and the cybernetic revolt would happen. This was when the Men of Iron rebelled against humanity. So just to go over that a little bit, there were basically castes of humanity, right? There were the Men of Gold. The Men of Gold, there's not a lot of information about them, but I theorize that they were perpetuals, right? And the Emperor was one of them. The Men of Gold were basically like the rulers of human civilization during the dark age of technology. The Men of Gold created the Men of Stone. The Men of Stone were basically what we called squats, or what we call now Votan, right? They're basically artificial life forms that were sent out into the galaxy in order to colonize worlds and prepare them for human habitation, right? So the Men of Stone were what we now call the Votan. And there's a bunch of evidence for this. I really like the way that Games Workshop corresponded this information. It was perfect. So the Men of Gold created the Men of Stone, and the Men of Stone created the Men of Iron. The Men of Iron were artificial intelligence, or machines guided by artificial intelligence. If you look at the Votan range now, they have their Ironkin. That's what they call the Men of Iron, right? They had their own Men of Iron, and humanity tried to create its own Men of Iron. So when the Men of Stone kind of like liberated themselves from humanity and became their own thing, they kind of moved to the galactic core and started their own civilizations. Humanity created its own Men of Iron, and it's these Men of Iron that rebelled against humanity, and that's what brought about the Dark Age. I mean, not the Dark Age of technology, the Age of Strife. In this aftermath of destruction, like civilization just fell. Planets across the Imperium were isolated from each other, and some thrived while others degraded until the societies on them regressed. You know, Terra specifically just became a war zone, like a irradiated war zone. People on Terra bombed the shit out of each other. Like, it was just bad. Like, everything had stopped. Everything had regressed back to a like primordial state of just constant war and survival. And it was during this time that the Emperor rose up from, you know, the techno-barbarian warlords and decided he wanted to claim Terra. He wanted to restart civilization. Remember, the Emperor has been around since forever, right? He's a perpetual. He's seen the eras of man. He's been through the age of Terra. He's been through the age of like exploration into the galaxy, the expansion. He's been through the dark age of technology. He's been through it all. He's seen it all. And so he feels confident and he wants to rebuild civilization. And this is what starts the wars of unification. First, he creates the Custodes. And it's interesting, right? This is a debated topic. You know, which did he create first? Did he create the Custodes or did he create the Thunder Warriors? Some people say one, some people say the other. I'm saying that he created the Custodes first. And if he did create the Custodes first, it's rather interesting, right? And I'll get back to that. But he created the Custodes first, and then he would lead human armies, right? Human armies across Terra to fight in the beginning or the early stages of the unification wars. Now, these human armies, a lot of the regiments that he had, he would modify them genetically so that they would be able to fight in certain arenas of war. So in the beginning, in the unification wars, he would use humans and modify them genetically so that they would be able to endure certain war zones or have certain abilities that would give them an upper hand against the techno-barbarian nation states that they would have to face. These modifications that he did to these regiments would inspire the emperor to create the Thunder Warriors. The Thunder Warriors were massive, hulking, muscular brutes of war, and they were made through genetic manipulation as well. And the reason why I said earlier that he created the Custodes first and that was interesting was because if he created the Custodes first, then he actually went downward as far as the quality of his transhuman warriors. The Custodes are perfect. We have no lore saying that he modified the Custodes after making them. You know, like he didn't touch up on the template of the Custodes. From the beginning, they were perfect. But then he created the Thunder Warriors, who were possibly intentionally not perfect. They were flawed. Their physiologies were not stable. They would often get overwhelmed in the middle of battle and they would like lose themselves, lose self-control, or like literally their bodies would start to just fail on them. They were faulty weapons, but they were efficient weapons. They were made to fight the wars of unification, and that they did, at least for the early unification wars. According to the information that we have on the Thunder Warriors, they were organized into legions, right? And each legion had a specialization of war. One of the legions that we know of is the 4th Legion, that were called the Iron Lords. And just by that alone, we can assume that these Thunder Warriors were basically the precursors to the Space Marines, both in their name and their focus, right? Because if you look at it, the Iron Lords specialized in siegecraft, right? But if you look at the 4th Legion of Adeptus Astartes, the 4th Legion are the Iron Warriors, who also specialized in siegecraft, right? There's also the, I believe, Eric Tyrannus, who I believe is on the cover of the Outcast Dead. If you look at the cover of the Outcast Dead, you'll see a Thunder Warrior in like Mark 1 armor, and the armor is purple. If that's Eric Tyrannus, that means Eric Tyrannus was the lightning bearer. He was the banner bearer of the emperor, right, during the unification wars. And if you look at his armor, if that's him on the cover, his armor is purple. And if you think about it, what legion has purple armor and is the herald of the emperor? The emperor's children, right? So there, you can look at the Thunder Legion or Thunder Warrior legions and see that they were like the testing ground for the legions, and they were created from these human regiments. And something that I found to be really interesting is when you research a lot of the legion history and you look at the legion history that happened during the unification wars, a lot of that history is not actually talking about the Space Marine legions. They're actually talking about the Thunder Warrior legions. In my last video for the Imperial Fists, I talk about how it was the Imperial Fist, it was the 7th Legion that secured the Himalayan mountains for the Emperor during the unification wars. And someone commented in the comments like, how can that be true? You know, the Imperial Fists weren't created until this time. And I was like, exactly, because remember, the Imperial Fists were already named by the Emperor before the Astartes Legion. Like they achieved their name before the Astartes Legion, which means that they weren't just called the Imperial Fists. The Thunder Warrior Legion, the 7th Legion of the Thunder Warriors, was called the Imperial Fists, and it was the Thunder Warrior Legion that secured the Himalayan mountains, not the Astartes Legion, because they were created much later. Now, of course, people can say, oh, maybe those were proto-legions, maybe, but if you look at a lot of the history, it's the battles that happened during the Wars of Unification happened too early. Astartes weren't even made by the time, or at the time, that the legions were doing what they were doing. And so a lot of times, if you look at it, the Thunder Warrior legions were the ones being referenced instead of the Astartes Legion. And I found that to be interesting. One of these days, I might do like a deep dive on the Thunder Warriors. I'm really interested in them. And honestly, 100%, I was thinking about building a Thunder Warrior Legion or a Thunder Warrior army, because I'm part of a group on Facebook. I think it's called Tyrants of the Unification Wars, where it's basically like people who build armies based around the Unification Wars. And of course, the Thunder Warriors were around during that time. And so I've been really considering doing like a 7th Legion Thunder Warriors. And as far as color scheme would be concerned, it would be the original Legion color schemes, right? So they would have like a gray color and like a yellow pauldron and all that stuff. I'm inspired, I might do it, I might not, but I've seen other people in the group do it as well. Someone created like a seriously cool 9th Legion, which is like the Blood Angels, or the precursors to the Blood Angels, the Revenant Legion, and they're all Thunder Warriors. It's amazing. But basically the Emperor created the Thunder Warriors, right? And when he created the Thunder Warriors, it was a downgrade in design, right? These were purposely made to be unstable. They were violent weapons to be used in order to conquer Terra. And once Terra was conquered, he wouldn't have a use for them, right? Now, the Thunder Warriors didn't think this for some reason, but, they were a temporary tool. Once Terra was under the Emperor's command, they had no use. They were actually a liability because they were made for war. But what do beings that were made for war do when there is no war, right? So this is why the Thunder Warriors were wiped out by the Custodes, right? And it makes sense that the perfect creation wipes out the imperfect creation. But then somewhere in the mix of that, the Emperor created the Primarchs. Going back to the original lore of the Primarchs, the goal for the Emperor, like I said, was to encourage the evolution of humanity to its highest form, which would be Homo sapiens superior. Everybody is a perpetual, basically, right? Now, the plan for the Primarchs, or at least the original plan for the Primarchs, was he made them to be artificial perpetuals, right? And they were supposed to guide humanity, right? And I don't know what time frame or time limitation the Emperor was thinking about these plans. Like, were the Primarchs supposed to lead humanity on Terra, or were they supposed to lead humanity across the galaxy? I'm leaning more toward maybe he was thinking of leading humanity, or having the Primarchs lead the different nation states of humanity on Terra. But because of what happened, the great scattering of the Primarchs across the galaxy, the situation kind of grew dire. Also, I question that perspective too, because the Emperor knew about aliens. He knew about how humanity would basically struggle against these aliens. They wouldn't be strong enough to handle or face these aliens. And so he created the Gene Seed. The Gene Seed would be used to create Space Marines. And different from both the Thunder Warriors and the early Imperial regiments that the Emperor had, that he modified, the Gene Seed was a tool that could be used, that could be implanted into a regular human being and turn them into a superhuman transhuman warrior, right? And so in this way, it is kind of genetic modification, but it's something of a different sort. It actually turned humanity by the Space Marines and the Gene Seed being connected to a Primarch, which is an artificial perpetual. By becoming Space Marines, humans were created or became artificial perpetuals. But Space Marines, similar to the Thunder Warriors, were made to fight. They were made as war tools, as weapons to fight in the wars of the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade was just the Emperor's goal to unite humanity across the galaxy, right? And the Primarchs, once they were recovered, they were put in charge of their legions, and those legions were tasked with securing territory for humanity, fighting the aliens and the horrors of the galaxy, and making it so that the galaxy itself belonged to the Emperor, right? So that was the purpose during the Great Crusade. But just like the Thunder Warriors, the Space Marines were tools. They were more efficient tools than the Thunder Warriors. They were more stable tools, or at least most of them were more stable, but their purpose was war. Their purpose was to be used in order to subjugate the galaxy. And it kind of makes you think, like, if the Horus Heresy didn't happen, what were the Emperor's plans for the Space Marines? Because if they were tools of war, what happens when there is no more war? I talk about this in my last video, like the Imperial Fists, at least, like Rogel Doran and the Imperial Fists, they at least acknowledged that they were not made for the world after the Great Crusade, right? Once the Great Crusade was complete and humanity was the dominant power in the galaxy, there would be no use for Space Marines. And at least I know the Imperial Fists accepted this. They knew we're not made for the world after this. We're made for this era right now. We're made for the Great Crusade. And so they accepted it. I wonder how many other legions accepted it as well. I mean, if you think about Horus's betrayal, where he thinks that the Emperor is going to become a god and he's going to get rid of the Primarchs and the Space Marines, maybe there was some truth to that, because what would be the point after the Great Crusade to keep Space Marines around? And so, like, let's think about it. Like, what if the Great Crusade was successful? The Emperor claimed humanity, reunited humanity across the galaxy, and it was all his, and all alien species were either subjugated or thwarted from our galaxy, and humanity just ruled the galaxy. What would be the point of Space Marines? Weapons of war. And so, is it possible that just like the Thunder Warriors, could the Custodes have eliminated the Space Marines? I know that the Emperor had some sort of secret tool that can destroy all Space Marines. Maybe he could have used that. But let's say, for example, that the Great Crusade was successful and there was no more need for Space Marines, right? And because there was no more need, they were all destroyed. Warhammer 40k would look completely different. Some of you are thinking it would be extremely boring, and I agree with you. Definitely, it would definitely be boring. But without Space Marines, without, like, let's say the Space Marines were destroyed at the end of the Great Crusade, without Space Marines, humanity by itself wouldn't be able to face aliens, right? If the aliens came back, like, for example, Tyranids. Imagine if there were no Space Marines. And then further into the history of Warhammer 40k, in an Imperium that is widespread, united across the galaxy, the Tyranids arrive. That actually is grimdark. That actually is kind of horrifying to think about, because humanity wouldn't be able to face that threat as they are. And if the Emperor was still alive, what would he do to humanity? Remember, the goal was to influence the evolution of humanity. So is it possible that maybe the Emperor makes humanity perpetuals? Maybe he does the same thing to humanity that he did to the legions, where he kind of tweaks them in their DNA and genetically modifies them so that they're still human. They're not transhuman warriors, but they're still humans. They're just modified humans, like how he had his initial armies during the Unification Wars. A few days ago, Games Workshop released an article about the Solar Auxilia color schemes for the different cohorts. And like a lot of the color schemes that they released, they had like color schemes of the legions. And I don't know why, but that was so hot to me. Like, I was like, what if there were no space marines? What if it was just human armies with the color of the legions, and like they were the legions instead of like transhuman, superhuman warriors connected to primarchs? What if it's just modified humans and like they had the color scheme of the space marine legions? I was like, that would be so hot. And I think one of the reasons why I think it would be hot is because I feel like, going back to what I said earlier, I feel like we see too many space marines. I don't think space marines should be the focus of the setting. It should be Astra Militarum. They are the true face of humanity in the grimdark future of Warhammer 40k, right? So I thought it was hot because I was like, oh, imagine if it was just humanity and like formed as if like they had the color schemes of the legions fighting against these aliens, and humanity was genetically modified, of course, but they weren't genetically modified to the extent of let's say space marines. Like, for example, right, instead of having a salamander space marine, right, it would be a genetically modified human that would be able to endure high areas of radiation. And so they would have the same skin complexion as salamanders, the same red burning eyes, but they would be genetically modified humans instead of a transhuman warrior that's turned into that through the gene seed, right? And in doing so, the Emperor makes them perpetuals, right? Or if there's like a detachment or Imperial Guard regiment that has the Canis Helix injected into them, not gene seed, not something connecting them to Lehman Russ, but just the Canis Helix itself. Like, and so we now have a bunch of werewolf super soldiers, but they're not transhuman warriors like the Space Marines or even the Thunder Warriors. They're just humans that have been genetically modified, very similar to how the Emperor did in the initial Unification Wars. I don't know, something about that is just super cool to me. I know a lot of you might think it's boring and like, oh great, so it's regular humans fighting in the Warhammer 40k setting, but I think Warhammer 40k should be about humans, at least when it comes to the Imperium. Like, it should be the Astra Militarum, it should be the Sisters of Battle. It should be regular humans that are slightly modified, but not transhuman warriors, not beings connected to a Primarch through their gene seed, just genetically modified warriors. But of course, we don't live in that kind of setting. Warhammer 40k is not that setting. And so we have Space Marines still. We have more chapters being created every founding. We have, chapters that have existed since the 30th millennium. And so Space Marines are, of course, a staple in Warhammer 40k. They are the face of the Imperial faction. But, sometimes I like to entertain certain thought trains. I'm like, wow, like what if, this scenario would happen instead of this scenario? And I guess in this video, I just wanted to talk about like, what if Space Marines were called at the end of the Great Crusade? Like, there just were no Space Marines left. And instead of Space Marines, the Emperor, who would have survived if the Horus Heresy hadn't happened, the Emperor just pushed humanity's evolution toward becoming perpetuals and genetically modified them so that they were perpetuals and that they could endure certain environments. I think that would be cool. Also, before I go, I want to answer a question that I got on my first video. Someone asked me in my comments, like, because I was talking about the Imperial Fists and how I think they are the best legion, the person asked me, which legion do I think is the worst legion, right? And I responded to them that that's hard for me to choose because I love Space Marines and I think all of the legions are unique and interesting in their own ways. So I can't really say that there's a legion that I think is the worst legion, because I think they're all interesting and they all serve a purpose. But if there was a legion that I'm kind of confused as to what their purpose is, it would be the Emperor's Children. And here's why, right? So if you look at the lore for the Emperor's Children and you look at the initial recruits to the Legion were recruited from the royal families of Terra. So all of the initial recruits to the Emperor's Children Legion were royalty, basically. And if you think about it, isn't that the same kind of lore or like origin story for the Custodes? The Custodes were made from the noble families of Terra, maybe just at a different time. Like the Custodes were made during the Unification Wars, and the Emperor's Children were made near the end of it. But both have their source in noble bloodlines, royal families and things like that. And if you look at the Emperor's Children, a lot of their aesthetic kind of imitates the Custodes, whether it be the plume of fur or hair that they have on their helmets, or some of the units have on their helmets, the spears that they use, the amount of gold that they use, the kind of design that they have on their armor. It's just very reminiscent of the Custodes. And so I think about it and I'm like, what's the purpose of them? The lore says that during the Unification Wars, the Third Legion served as the heralds of the Emperor. It's why they were given the Aquila as their symbol. Like, it was a gift to them because they represented the Emperor and the Imperium and all the ideals of both, right? But it's kind of like, at this time, the Emperor had the Imperial Fists, which traveled with him everywhere. They were his Praetorians. If anyone was his herald, it was the Imperial Fists. He literally traveled with them, right? They worked besides the Emperor. They protected the Emperor. They fought under the Emperor. And I mean, all legions did, of course, but I'm saying specifically, the 7th Legion was given the name Praetorians of Terra, and his guardians his Praetorians because they accompanied the Emperor everywhere, right? So I look at the 3rd Legion, I'm like, what's the point of them? Like, they're a cool legion as far as aesthetically. The color, the purple and the gold is just delicious. It's beautiful. But, like, I don't understand what the point of the Emperor's Children is. If they're just standard bearers of the Emperor, that could be fulfilled by another legion. Pursuers of perfection, okay, but if you think about it, so do the Ultramarines. Like, the Ultramarines are basically that too. So I just don't understand the purpose of the Emperor's Children. But I guess, they're one of the more they're one of the legions that fell the hardest, right, because of the heights that they tried to reach. So I guess they make more sense in a 40k setting to me than they do in a 30k setting. That's no disrespect to Emperor Children players, but I'm just saying, like, if you have the Custodes and you have the Imperial Fists and you have the Ultramarines, you kind of don't need the 3rd Legion. You don't need the Emperor's Children. The design for them, or the focus of them, the theme of them, should have been different, in my opinion. But that's pretty much it. I just wanted to make an episode about that and talk about, like, what would Warhammer 40k be without Space Marines? And I think it would be pretty cool. I really think we don't see enough Imperial Guard versus Imperial Guard battles. I want to see more of those, and I guess in Horus Heresy you're able to do that with the Solar Auxilia, and maybe I will, maybe I won't. I recently played Imperialis. I ended up creating my own Solar Auxilia cohort for Imperialis, and now I'm thinking, like, do I want to do this at the normal scale? And now I have another project that I'm inspired to do. We'll see, by the end of the month if I still want to do it. But like, I feel like we don't see enough human versus human battles in Warhammer 40k. I know a lot of people are like, same faction battles are boring. I don't think so. We have the Siege of Rax, like that was epic. People still play that setting and collect that setting. And so I wish we saw more human versus human battles. And even though I love Space Marines, like, my Void Lions are the best. I've played so many Space Marine armies. I love Space Marines. Even though I love Space Marines, I do feel like they shouldn't be the face of Warhammer 40k. They should have the mythology around them that they inherited at the end of the 30th millennium, when the Crusade stopped and everything went to shit again. They should have that mythological air. In fact, if I were to say something kind of heretical, I would say that the Custodes should not be a playable faction in Warhammer 40k. The Custodes should not leave Terra, right? But I know that they want to have another range to be used on the tabletop in order to make more money. I get it. But lore wise, because the Custodes failed in protecting the Emperor, they should not leave his side. They should not leave Terra, right? And so I don't think that Custodes should be a playable faction in Warhammer 40k, but instead that Space Marines are treated like how Custodes are. Because if you look at Custodes armies, they're like a few models, because each of them is hella expensive and they're just super tough and they have all these cool abilities. Instead of Custodes in Warhammer 40k, the Space Marines should be treated like Custodes, meaning even Space Marine players shouldn't be able to field large numbers of Space Marines. Each Space Marine should be like hella points. You know, like you have to really think about how many what you want to bring as far as Space Marines are concerned, because you can't bring everything that you might want. Like every model is high point cost. Every weapon of war that they have is high point cost, which would equal, or which would result in very few Space Marines being put on the tabletop, but they are strong as fuck, right? I think that should be the situation. And then the basic troop of the most common troop of humanity, or the Warhammer 40k setting, would be the Astra Militarum. So basically it would be like a push-up. Instead of Space Marines, it should be Astra Militarum, and instead of Custodes, it should be Space Marines, right? I think that would be cool, but maybe I'm bugging. What do you guys think? Tell me what you think in the comments below. But thank you for listening. Let me know if you like this podcast situation more than you do my regular videos. Of course, I'm going to continue my regular videos, but I have to admit the podcast format is way easier for me, because as far as editing the video, you don't really have to, like, I don't have to do the editing involved in, like, you know, picking images, making transitions, doing all the editing stuff. I don't have to do that. It's just me talking, right? And also, my regular videos are sources of information. They're sources of lore. In my podcast episodes, I feel like I want to be a little bit more expressive of my personal opinion rather than just, or my personal interpretation of the lore rather than what's canon and the, you know, standard information. So let me know if you like this podcast situation more. I really dig it. So, you know, even if some people don't like it, I'm probably still going to do it. I want to try and do one every week. You know, just talk about things that inspire me about the Warhammer 40k universe. But yeah, like I said, if you like this format, let me know in the comments below, and if enough people like it, I might do a episode every week just talking about something random, you know, just casually, not so structured as my regular videos. But thank you for listening. I want to create like an intro and an exit that's different from my regular lore videos, but for now I can't really think of one. So the Emperor protects, and the future is successor.